started. Hi. Welcome to Positive Thursday. As you can tell, we're a day off this week, but I think it's still going to be pretty positive. So first of all, before we get into this, I'm Susan.
I'm Kim.
And this is Kim, and we're your Positive Fellows, as you probably know, for the year, and we're just getting started off with our first session.
So let us introduce Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi. Dr. Csikszentmihalyi is a distinguished professor of psychology and as well as CGU. He's noted for his work in the study of happiness and creativity, but as you guys all know, he's best known for his theory of flow. His book includes Flow, The Evolving Self, and Creativity, and he's now the director of Quality of Life Research Center at CGU, and also a distinguished member of a variety of important associations in psychology. Also, Mike is our beloved professor, so we always take his class, and but it's kind of a rare opportunity even for us to hear his talk outside of class at CGU, so I think this is a very special moment for all of us in this room, so I'm very excited to introduce him. Please welcome Dr. Csikszentmihalyi.
Good afternoon, and thank you very much, Kim and Susan. That was great, and I'm glad to be here. And what I'm going to do today, actually, it's kind of a rehearsal for a talk I will be giving in 2 days at in San Antonio, Texas, for the annual meeting of the Consumer Society, the Society for Consumer Psychologists of America. And I have been working with some of the people in that group of psychologists for quite a while. In fact, we had a meeting here. Gene Nakamura and I had a meeting of some of these consumer psychologists like 10 years ago, trying to get them to understand a little bit in a broader sense what consumer psychology should be concerned with. Because unfortunately a lot of consumer psychologists in the past were essentially studying marketing strategies and advertising methods and things of that sort, without much concern with what the outcomes of the laboring brought in the long run. So now there is a large group of these consumer psychologists have become a special subsection of the group, and they are called themselves as transformative consumer societies, and they are so I wrote the introduction to a book they put out a couple of years ago about transformative consuming, and so they have been they are beginning to turn a little bit into a larger, more interesting and deeper kind of group than they had been before. My interest really in this whole issue that I will be talking about today came probably about over 50 years ago, when I was about your age, when I read a book written by a professor, a German philosopher who spent half the year at the University of Chicago. And in the 50s, she came out with a book called in English it was The Human Condition, and there, which is, by the way, a book I recommend highly. If you have time to read besides schoolwork, you can pick up a copy. You won't get credit for it because it's written by a philosopher, so or the psychologist, you don't get credit for that. But it's a good book. And I was struck when I read it first by a passage which now I have to kind of quote out of context, but essentially in that passage, what she was saying, that, okay, she's a social historical philosopher who looks at essentially the evolution of culture, the evolution of society over time, and how that has changed the nature of human beings. And she comes to the end of the book where she says that, well, this was a great journey up to now, but at this point it looks like humans are kind of ready to consume the world out of their inability to find anything meaningful to do with their time and with their energies. And that was written before anybody was really worried about sustainability, conservation, all of those things that now we take seriously. At that point, people, if they were worried about anything, they were worried about the hydrogen bomb or maybe the A bomb. But the notion of worrying about the planet as being essentially consumed by those who live on it and have achieved kind of supremacy among the living species on it, that the humans could actually consume the world was kind of a hyperbole. It looked like a very interesting metaphor, but now, 50 years later, it's not at all metaphorical anymore. It seems like it's description of a real possibility. So now looking at this situation of what happened to the world in the last few decades, as you know, positive psychology kind of developed a voice of its own a dozen years ago at the most. And mostly positive psychology has been concerned about the inner emotional well-being of people and how to maintain it and restore it and so forth. And I think that will always be the primary concern of what positive psychology is. But I think we would be completely remiss if we didn't consider also what happens in the environment in which we have to live. And if we can stay happy, but if the place in which we live gets worse and worse and eventually uninhabitable, then that would not be a smart way of allocating our energy, our intelligence. So I think this is going to be a challenge for positive psychology. So let me say a little bit more about consuming, because although the word is quite obvious, it has nuances that I think we should consider. I'd like to define what consuming means as a process by which an organized system, living system, is broken down in order to preserve or enhance the existence of another organized entity. So we are talking here about essentially a form of entropy that locally functioning entropy where energy is being sucked out in the environment by breaking down other systems like plants or minerals or other living systems, so that we, being at the chain of the food supply, can consume or in turn keep our identity as human beings by using the decomposed ingredients of other systems. And this sounds fine as long as we are at the top of the food chain, right? So there is no problem in consuming all kinds of things. We consume chicken, we consume petroleum products, we consume the water by injecting all those cyanide-based compounds to make fracking of petroleum possible, and at the same time the water tables are being polluted and so forth. So all of these are examples of consuming other living things, water, which is necessary for life around the globe, and then other resources like petroleum, where you have to break down what is kind of a stable system into one that we can then generate energy with for our cars and homes and so forth. Well, and we can, as I said, we can do this because we are at the top of the supply chain, but of course it's not like we are not being consumed. I mean, we are being literally consumed at times by viruses, bacteria, cancer cells, and so forth. And in a more subtle but very real way, we are consumed by things like jealousy, we are consumed by ambition, we are consumed by unmet desires, all of which in a way are taking our mind, the content of our mind, and breaking them down in a certain way to use it for their own purposes. And often those purposes are unconscious, we don't know them, or if we know them, we give them a good name, whereas they are not really that good. But they survive and they multiply these entities of information, like, as I say, ambition, for instance, by using our energy for its own purposes. So these are the more extended forms of organization that use us for their own purposes. This is in what the British biologist Richard Dawkins in the 70s called memes. The memes are organized information that survive because we pay attention to them, and the memes tell us what to do, just as genes tell us what to do, but genes tell very basic, old programs of action, whereas memes can suddenly take our energy and direct it in directions that someone else has decided was a good way to use human energy, which ideologies, for instance, religions, ideologies, ways of life that are being advertised, that this is how you should live, and this is a great life, and people are, in a sense, consumed by these new directions, new projects that the memes create in our minds. So this is essentially the background to what I wanted to say. And what I want to say is just the beginning of trying to think a little bit about how positive psychology relates to this whole set of issues about consuming. And first of all, let's say that positive psychologists have studied the effects of being good consumers. And good consumers meaning people who value material goals above most other goals. And some of the studies by Belk and especially Tim Kasser, have followed children from 12 years on and found that the more the child has focused on getting more toys, getting more sports equipment, more tangible or consumer items, that's the horizon of their future aspirations. Their hopes are all for this kind of thing. The more that happens, the more anxious they get as they grow up, depressed. They don't enjoy themselves. Their experiences are negative. They tend to be more addicted to substances, that prohibited substances, and they also have just basic health issues, more diabetes, obesity, and so forth. As opposed to those kids whose goals are more directed to the well-being of the family or their own learning or their own activities that are not necessarily materially based, they report more pleasant emotions day by day. They have better friendships. They are more generous in experimental situations where they manipulate. They measure how much they would be ready to share with others. And they're more sociable, they're more, which goes with friendliness, and more cooperative. So this is one kind of trend in the literature and the research in positive psychology which bears on consumer issues. I just wanted to try also a more kind of theoretical way of looking at this thing, and so I have a little model that I want to present, which is at first, it's very simple. So let's take, for instance, let's take a matrix for measuring what good really an act of consumption brings to you. Any act, okay? So on the vertical axis is simply whether the benefit of the consuming activity is simply yours or it's also for others. So that's that. And here we could think of material benefits like sensual, survival, health, wealth, power, physiological benefits on the left, and to the right, psychological benefits. So the psychological benefits would be things like comfort, safety, self-expression, self-esteem, and flow, things like that sort. And in that case, for instance, let's take a very simple example of somebody having a good steak. Okay, consuming a steak, let's say, okay, it's an act of consumption. And let's assume just for illustration purposes, that gives you quite a bit of benefit. I mean, you enjoy the steak, and it's a material benefit, mainly sensuous, but also somewhat psychological, not as much, but you feel that this is really a fairly tasty steak, and you are a connoisseur of food, and so it has some psychological benefit, but it's practically no benefit to others in this case, okay? Now, suppose that now we go to, and we think about, it's the same steak, but this now is organically raised steak, okay? So let's say that the benefit to the self are still the same as before, 3 and 3, but now it's two and two, two psychological and two others, for the reason that if psychological benefits may come from the fact that you know that you're eating a biologically fed, the organically fed animal probably had a much better life roaming on the prairies instead of being raised in a box. And to a certain extent, you feel that there is some benefit to the culture or the society in which you live. Of course, that depends on the person. I mean, if you don't care about organic food, then this is not a valid comparison. If you are a vegetarian, it's not a valid comparison either. But if we just think of a person who is kind of somewhat sensitive but still eats meat, which is a bad thing, but there it is, then this particular experience of consumption includes a lot more benefits. I put that kind of, see that little blue square to show how more, in a sense, more extensive it is. No, this is the, okay, so here you have a much smaller area of benefit, if you want to talk that, use that language, whereas here it's a much, you are tapping more into more values, in a sense. Values to the person, values to others, psychological, material, and so forth. Well, that's okay as a starting point. Obviously, you want to go beyond that. So here is a somewhat more complex map. See, we still have the same 4 dimensions on the green lines, but then the red lines show other considerations, other benefits that we should consider. For instance, is this act of consuming benefits what are the long-term consequences? Or is it just short-term? The other one, is it useful? Useful is fine, but how about beauty? Is it something that adds to the savoring of the environment or the savoring of life, which gives it beauty? So we could begin to think of consumption as being on a scale of benefits that it can produce. And we usually think of consumption in terms of the dollar value you have to spend and the profit that somebody has in making it. But I think the challenge, it seems to me, is that we are beginning to develop different metrics, not just the metric of utility and material value, but begin to think of how we are, what are we going to create for the future in terms that is useful to others, to the self, that has material psychological benefits. And this is as I say, the next step. Finally, I think the final step would be to ask yourself, depending on what your area of work is, in what sense, what are those other things that you would like to achieve through that act of consumption? And here we just have question marks because it depends on you and depends on what you're doing. What are you working as a telephone repair person, or are you raising cattle in Wyoming, or are you what is your life? Um, how is your life intersecting with consumption, both as a producer of future consuming events and as a practicing consumer, as using what has been produced by others. So the question is, for a full understanding of the impact that these acts of consumption have on not only on the present, but more importantly, perhaps on the future. In order to understand that, we need to develop a more systematic understanding of what we are doing. Because, see, the point is that until this point in history, until maybe the time that I was your age, nobody cared much about this stuff because there was no reason to fear that the impact of humans on the planet would be really very extensive. Of course, humans have desolated enormous tracts of land everywhere at one point or other. Greenland, for instance, as if you read the book by Jared Diamond called Collapse, Greenland, this big, huge island up in the North Atlantic, was a prosperous green, was in fact a green land except for the interior, but there was this whole area of green vegetation for many miles on the coast. And it was so enticing that the Vikings thought that it was like they arrived in California or something. You know, it was a beautiful place. But then they brought their cattle with them because they didn't like the fish, believe it or not. I mean, the Vikings didn't like fish. But so they just wanted steak as much as possible. And of course, these were organically fed steaks, but at the same time, they were trampling the whole and eating up all the green land until the Vikings had to leave after trying cannibalism for a while, and they had to finally abandon the place. So that has happened in the past. It has happened here and there in many parts of the world. Egypt was a cornucopia of lovely productivity that exported grains to Rome and so forth. The area between the Tigris and the Euphrates River in Mesopotamia, which is now Iran, or Iraq, actually, was also a wonderful area of, there was a saying that you could travel all the way from the Caspian Sea to the Red Sea, 2,000 miles, and never not hear the crowing of roosters. In other words, there were so many farms there that there was always some rooster, even as you walked, 2,000 miles. It was a very, very fertile area, but now there's nothing practically growing there. So this has happened in the past, but in the past, people always blamed, the weather, the lack of water, something or other, but they did not really face up to the fact that the future of the planet was really in human hands. And those hands were feeble hands in the past, but now we have hands that can break the surface of the earth, which is what fracking does now. It can change the climate. It can do all kinds of things that before were impossible. So I think because of that, this is now a challenge where I think anyone who is concerned about well-being, happiness, the future of well-being of our children and so forth, should begin to take a serious look at. And we are very far from having developed much to contribute in this direction, but I'm glad to see that you are planting those trees next week or something, right? Up in, although I don't know, those hands that held that, they look like they were holding coal. I don't know how anything can grow in that, but maybe it's good earth. I don't know. I hope it's good. Anyway, that's that. So we are making some big start in trying to understand how to coexist with the rest of the planet in a way that is good, at least in this respect. And this is simply kind of the beginning of saying, okay, how can we represent the consequences of the actions that we take in this respect and consumer actions, and hopefully, 2 or 3 years from now, this will be obsolete and much more refined and better models will exist, and people will be working hard at trying to work on those. So that's probably all I wanted to say, and if you have some questions after, we could do.
We have question marks. You have short-term, long-term, material benefit, psychological benefit, and then usefulness, beauty. It doesn't necessarily matter what you put there, because that one isn't necessarily opposing one or the other.
No, that's why I put question marks, because I could put so many other things, but I didn't know whether those were the important ones. I think up to this point, I think those are fundamental issues. After that, I think we have to think about what we want to put. For instance, I mean, I don't have environmental impact as such there, for instance. That would be essential too, but I thought that the benefit to others was kind of part of it, but it could be separated out. I mean, you could put at the ends of those question marks, you could put anything: air, water, animals, etc., and see how they are affected.
Well, I worked for a large media company for many years, and you take the big issue today about guns, violence, video games. You could set up a similar kind of thing for a big company would say, okay, what's our social responsibility here? Let's say with video games or mass media entertainment on one hand, and then people's enjoyment or whatever they're getting out of it on the other hand, and they could have that kind of discussion.
Yeah, absolutely. I think what you're suggesting, I think this would work with almost any human organization, but here I was focusing at the consumer end rather than the producer end. What you're talking about in a media conglomerate, you are producing, as you say, video games, and you could ask for video games the same. I wasn't thinking about the production, and I was thinking about the consumption, but I think that's a good point. I think it should be usable for there too.
Well, I was in big management meetings, and they're consuming.
The what?
The management of these companies, they're consumers too.
Completely
on the opposite end.
Sure.
They're consuming it also. It's just an interesting way of organizing your discussion and thought on the subject.
Yeah, I think so. I'm not saying this is the last word, for heaven's sake, but it's a first step. Okay, and I think It's simply because, I read the consumer psychology literature, and they haven't yet kind of freed themselves from a kind of fairly business as usual kind of approach. They think, okay, how can we sell more of this to younger kids or older people or whatever, and they can think of how can we avoid being sued for something or other, but to have a kind of proactive view of how to add value to what they do. They haven't come up with a good model, and this is simply an attempt to say, okay, so what's valuable about these things we do, and try to maximize that and see how much you can, what difference that makes. Yeah.
I want to continue with a little the idea of the Game Boy, because I grew up in a little bay in the jungle, barefoot, and I was completely in touch with the space, the water, the river, the animals and all that. It was fantastic. When I go back now, it's so sad. I see kids, little, playing Game Boys, and they're completely disconnected with the place. Completely disconnected. They can be in a room, 4 walls, it will be the same for them. Then the consequences that has is enormous, because it's creating a disconnection, completely disconnection with the environment.
Yeah. That's, urbanization has created all these slums and wastelands where people had a kind of a real, we studied some places, for instance, our colleagues in Italy that we collaborate with have been studying old mountain communities in the Alps where people have been living for centuries with bare subsistence, but they wrote poetry, they had plays, they played music, they had their nice little wooden chalets and so on, so perfectly fine. But so they interviewed 3 generations there, the grandparents, parents, and the grandchildren. And the grandchildren can't wait to hop on the motorcycle and go down to the city, 20 miles, and hang out in the bars and discos and stuff, whereas the parents are still so attached to the environment that it's incredible. For instance, at one point there was this woman, 74-year-old woman, who they wanted to interview for the project, and the other people in the village said, oh, Serafina, she went up to get hay to the pasture. She will be here back in about half an hour. So then after a while, they see this 74-year-old woman up in the mountain coming down with a backpack kind of a bamboo type of thing, full of straw, which was 3 times as high as she did. Twice more than she was on top. And she was going, and they noticed that she was taking all this strange kind of way down, and took her half an hour to come down. And so the psychologist asked her, by the way, just to break the ice, he said, well, how come you were coming down so zigzag down the mountain? And she said, if I go the same way twice, it tramples the grass too much. So whenever I come, I try to find a different way. And she has this tower of hay on her back and all that. But those people, they asked, if you ask her what's the most enjoyable thing, and the other people in the village, the older ones, they say, it's feeding the cattle, or planting the garden, the vegetable garden, or doing something like this, and it's so great to see it grow. You know, the onions grow and the peas grow and go up, and so every day it's more, and you feel part of it. But yeah, the kids, the grandkids, don't do it anymore. You know, they go. Some of them may return it to when they are older. They will become like that, but not most of them. I don't think.
Hey, I really like your model, and I like thinking about ways that we can be more thoughtful about consumption and try to maximize the benefits where possible. But as I was looking at the model, I wondered if you might also have this juxtaposed with one that looks just like it, but is thinking about the costs of consumption. And so just being more thoughtful about what are the long-term consequences, and what are the psychological harms, and what are the harms to beauty of the environment, or whatever the case may be. And although some consumption we might be able to maximize benefit, the costs might outweigh the benefits, leading to fewer or less consumption overall.
No, absolutely. Once you have, see, that's why I think I want to start with the theory, the conceptual structure. Once you have that, then you can apply it in many ways. Like, for instance, in advertising, that's one of the things is that this consumer psychologist may think about how to advertise these other values, as many of them as possible, in their products, assuming that they are not falsifying the data, but they actually do have some effect in one way or the other, and that in turn gets people to think about it. Oh, wouldn't it be better to have a bathroom cleaner that smells really good instead of cloying and obtrusive, and have a kind of a fine scent to it in a way that, and so just to take one example, I mean, whatever, you can realize, once you realize the potential value that things could have if you paid attention and doing it that way, then yeah, I think people will want those too. And just by advertising or presenting products with a kind of a positive message of this is something that is going to make the earth more beautiful, or people less depressed, or whatever, and so I think that would be then the ideal, actually, because then people would get used to it and would demand it and would want to have it, and you don't have to worry about it anymore. But at this point, it's a long process of education or sensitivization. Yeah. Yes?
I thought something was interesting that you read in the beginning. I think it was the definition of consumption, because I've never really understood it to be, the definition that you shared, at least the way that I heard it, it seemed like there was some sort of reciprocal process going on, as opposed to just like a one-way relationship. Like, I'm going to take this and use it because I need it, or like it benefits me in some way. And I think that was, even though it was just a simple definition, I think even that's kind of like a step one of where to start, like trying to get people to think, okay, well, how can my purchasing decisions, what am I giving back through making this decision? I don't know, maybe at least I hope I heard the definition right.
No, I think you're right. I may have purposefully, emphasized the downside of consumption, But basically, most consumption is form of entropic disassembling to be reassembled in the image or in the need, according to the need of someone who's consuming the thing. And you can give also many more pleasant definitions of consuming, but I think when you really look at it, it's not a reciprocal zero-sum. It is a zero-sum. I mean, few chicken eater masters, just to use one of these. But also, just think about maybe this is because one of my sons who has become a big crusader against fracking, and he has assembled data. Actually, he has built several drones that fly over the fracking places in Wyoming and North Dakota, and even close to home here, and show what happens to the earth there afterwards. So when you think they took whatever the latest deposits here are at least 70 million years old, okay? And this was a slow formation which obeyed the laws of nature, gravity and all the chemical changes in it. And, it exists, it produces good water and so forth. And now, in order to get the tiny amounts of petroleum that have stuck to the rocks, you have to inject these chemicals, which are cyanide-based, and then pump up the water with water and extract the little oil from the water. But in the meantime, all the bad stuff stays down. And all this long-term development of a sustainable geology that makes it possible for us to live is now changed. And it's not changed because we wanted to change it. It changed because of a general idea of progress needs more fuel, and we need to have more fuel to live comfortably and so forth. And so let's get to scrape up the bottom of the reserves, and the stories he has to tell, I learn mostly from him because the press doesn't really tell you much about what's going on, but how property values in certain areas of even New England, where people can their children die from the water that comes up from the wells, and the house values go down the drain, and people who have saved all their life to live in a decent little house out on the edge of the forest now don't have anywhere to go. And so these are things that are happening, and they're happening because we don't have the information, partly we don't have a model, understanding of how this relates to our future. We think everything is going to be better. We'll have more oil, we will have more whatever, and yeah, sure, some problems will happen, but it's a bigger problem than that. It's a whole kind of attitude towards the world that is strange. One of the most interesting religions, and maybe that I came across, for instance, is the one that most of you haven't known much. I didn't know much about them, but the Zarathustrians back in 2,000 years ago had they lived in Persia, kind of northwest of Persia, and what they had a understanding that their duty as human beings was to ask forgiveness every evening before going to sleep of what they did to the water, to the air, to the forest, to the grass, to the animals, and for each kind of consumption of the bad kind that they did, they had to apologize, and that was part because they thought that the world existed in a tension between two forces, the forces of order and growth, and the forces of decay and decomposition, namely entropy in modern terms. And they thought that it was the responsibility of any human being to take sides in this conflict and to try to preserve order and growth and eliminate the breaking down of order in whether it's the earth or plants or air or water. So that was a religion that anticipated, by 2,000 years what we have to do now. And I don't know how come they came to this insight. Maybe it was a sudden population growth or something that made them aware that these things are very fragile, and you can't assume that they will be there if you don't take care. So, but anyway, so they had it, and I think in a sense we have to, looking around us with more scientific eyes, must realize that they were right, and we need to learn from them too. Anyway, that's a long story.
We'll take one more question, and then we have wine and cheese reception outside, so if you don't mind, we can talk more there outside.
Yeah, I work with a few Native American tribes. They have a similar way that they approach it too. But you were saying about the children. I have 3 grandchildren. I grew up in New York City, so I did the opposite. I started climbing and doing backpacking in my 30s and totally hooked. But it can go the other way, but I think it's probably swimming upstream. But there's a book, you mentioned Jared Diamond before, and I don't know if you read his latest book on, let me get the title right, The World Until Yesterday. It just, recent book, but it's on the subject. It just works out. What he's trying to do is study the few native and aboriginal tribes that still exist, or peoples that still exist, mostly in New Guinea or whatever, and try to capture what it is that they have before they become westernized or modernized or whatever term you want to use. But the interesting thing about the book, he goes back, how he writes, and the book raises more questions than answers, which makes it an incredible reflection piece. But what he's trying to talk about is when we move forward and when we make decisions to move forward and evolve, we sometimes leave things behind that don't work towards our evolutionary benefit. Even though we're evolving, on the one hand, what looks like it's better, on the other hand, we're losing some things. So he has some really interesting examples in the book, and he deals with child rearing, he deals with work, war, all kinds of things. It's pretty extensive. But if people are interested in exploring this, it's a really nice introduction to some of those issues.
No, he understands these things very well, and I think that really the thing I was trying to do today is to get those of you who are interested in positive psychology realize that this is a growing concern, a growing problem, and presenting all kinds of great challenges for lots of people. So that's it. Okay.